Hi everyone, welcome. This is officially the computer science colloquium series, as well as today jointly with ISTS. I'm Denise Anthony from ISTS, for those of you who don't know me. So we are really happy to be working with computer science today to bring our speaker, Andrew Odlyzko, am I saying that correctly? He is currently professor in the School of Mathematics at the University of Minnesota. He has been, in the past, the founder and director of the Digital Technology Center, also director of the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute, and also assistant vice president for research, all at the University of Minnesota. And before that, he had a career at Bell Labs, AT&T Bell Labs, for many years as a technologist. And yet, it's so interesting to talk to Andrew and to think about these projects, because he does something after my own heart, which is really try to think about new technologies from a socio-historical context. And how does that context, what can we learn from the history on other technologies that can help us understand the internet and communication technologies today? So we welcome Andrew here, and I think you can tell us how you like to do the presentation, if you prefer to take questions or wait till the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and certainly I'm happy to take questions during the presentation if you feel like asking some. So today I'll be talking about how we can have security within secure systems, and the subtitle of it might be In Praise of Spaghetti Code. And this might upset a few people who, I might be teaching software engineering in that case, but well, we'll see how you respond to it. So, motivation and outline of the talk. So, basic question I want to address is, what is the role of cryptography in security in society? And in particular, why haven't they lived up to the promise? And I'll talk about what I mean by a promise. I'm one of the old-timers. I got into this area about 30 years ago, in what I call the golden age of civilian research in cryptography and security. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what people hope to achieve. And the next question is the future going to be any better? And the main points, my conclusions, are that there are actually very strong economic, social, and psychological reasons for insecurity, and that no, things are not going to get much better. Chewing gum and baling wire are continue to reign, and that we should really think a little bit differently. We should change our approach from thinking about absolute security to instead thinking about speed bumps, and I'll talk about how we might implement such. And that we should represent a new design philosophy and some change in direction. I mean, I'm not saying that we should abandon research or any of the other techniques, but I think we should change the emphasis and to use a different philosophy in our research. So, kind of a brief overview. When you think about security, you can think about it as being like an inverted pyramid. At the bottom you have the mathematical algorithms, which is the thing which was so enticing to people like myself back about 30 years ago and attracted a lot of attention because it had a lot of intellectual appeal as well as potential practical importance. And then on top of the algorithms, well, sort of one of the things that again attracted people like myself to the area is that the pioneers who came before us in the 1970s opened up an avenue towards what seemed to be a way to rebuild cryptography on new grounds, provide provable security, which will be based on appeal to some very basic mathematical problems. So now we would have a nice clean field as opposed to this kind of messy jumble of things that nobody fully understood and was used just simply because nobody had managed to break it. Instead, we would have these nice clean constructions, which would be kind of provable, probably correct. Well, we haven't succeeded in doing that. But we've done fairly well. In practice, practically none of the attacks that we hear about, and we hear about them all the time, attack the mathematical algorithms. The attacks tend to concentrate on higher levels of this inverted pyramid, namely on top of the algorithms you build protocols, and protocols are much less secure. We know much less how to really design them well. And then on top of protocols, we have systems, and those systems have lots and lots of bugs. We know that from lots of experience. When you talk about Windows or Linux having tens of millions of lines of code, we know there are lots of bugs in there. And then on top of that, we have the users, the people. And that's the element that's hardest to change. Homo sapiens does not evolve very fast. And yet all these technologies are there to serve human people. And so the question is, how do you do that? Okay? And that imposes big limitations on what we can do technologically. So we now have a lot of experience, again, even before the internet, we had experience with computers, and I think we have a lot of experience that proves 2 points. One is that people cannot build secure systems. I'll talk a little bit about it. And second, that people cannot live with secure systems, which is also very important to bear in mind. That people cannot build secure systems, well, lots of evidence. Windows is just one prototypical example, but there are many others. And what's especially surprising is that even fairly small systems, which had been kind of designed by top-notch people, as soon as their complexity gets beyond a certain bound, they turn out to be insecure, almost invariably. In some cases, it takes a long time to find it, though. I'm thinking of things like Schroeder protocol took essentially decades to find the weakness. Those kinds of things, really very basic, very fundamental. Now, certainly there has been progress in proving formal proofs of correctness of programs or security of programs. Again, I'm not knocking that research. It has made progress, but that progress has been outpaced in the growth of complexity and resulting in security in actual systems that are deployed. So we simply cannot build secure systems. I think that's kind of a basic conclusion I draw from it. Furthermore, we cannot live with them. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about it. So here's one kind of example which kind of straddles the boundary between these two points I made. This is about a decade old. Something I really found hilarious when I received it in an email, and I've been kind of citing it. Many people find it hilarious. It's the honor system virus. It's an email that comes around and says, this virus works on the honor system. Please forward this message to everyone you know, and then delete all the files on your hard disk. Thank you for your cooperation. And you can really laugh. And the thing is, though, that while I think this honor system virus is safe to show to this audience, it might be safe to show it to every audience. As is true of most good jokes, it goes just a little bit beyond what's truly plausible and what really happens in real life. And in fact, back around that time, a decade ago, when this honor system virus came out, there were a number of documented instances of AOL subscribers. So in those days, AOL was not a kind of company as kids. It was trying to reinvent itself. AOL was the dominant ISP. Everybody was worried about what they would do by dominating the internet. Anyway, so a number of people received emails saying, no, our automated scanning system has detected a virus infection on your computer. Please go into your find command, look for a file called AOL.exe and delete it. And many people did it, and then they called up AOL complaining they could not log on. Okay? Never underestimate how naive the bulk of the population is. Okay? And so this is a problem. So, first of all, we cannot build systems that are truly secure technologically in terms of satisfying the basic properties of security. And second, for the whole system to be secure, the human element, okay, has to be prevented from doing damage to it. And it's very hard to do when you have lots of very, very naive, essentially technophobic people. And I'll talk some more about it. Now, also, there's another problem why we could not live with secure systems, something I've been citing for a while. Namely, if you had truly secure systems, then secretaries could not forge their bosses' signatures. Now, for many of you, especially students, this may not mean very much. If you have ever worked in a large bureaucratic organization, then you probably do have a better appreciation for it. And I once worked for a large bureaucratic organization that shall remain nameless, and was in a process of moving to a paperless environment where all the kind of approvals were being done electronically. And I was a kind of small cog in a big machine. I was a low-level manager, but I went and checked with all the managers level above me, the people I knew. I actually checked with their secretaries. It turns out all of them were sharing their passwords with their secretaries. Why? Because in a big bureaucratic organization, secretaries have got to be able to forge their boss's signatures. Otherwise, things come to a grinding halt. And the mark of a good secretary is that he or she knows that it's okay to forge the boss's signature on a reorder for, say, photocopy paper. It's not okay to forge the boss's signature on order hiring somebody. Okay? There is a certain human element comes in here. And of course, the technologist's usual answer is, well, but we're going to build delegation features into our system. Well, you can, but problem is those tend to be cumbersome, and they introduce new security holes, and they typically don't work very well either. So this is a real problem. People simply don't fit very well with formal systems. Okay? And of course, again, many of you teach courses, logic, mathematics, other areas, and you know how hard it is to get people to kind of understand the basic concepts of mathematics. Well, it's also hard to get people to follow strict rules. People actually like to have a lot of slack in their lives. So that's a problem for secure systems. Even if we could build them, I don't think human race would be able to put up with them. Now, what is my proposed solution? Okay, well, it's not a really kind of a clean solution of any kind. It's a kind of change in design philosophy. And again, it's not a brilliant new insight. Rather, it's derived from an observation of how it is that we have lived as well as we have over the last few decades. How have we stumbled into these partial solutions to our problems of insecure systems? And so my solution, again, is dramatically different from what I used to believe and what I used to preach. Dramatically different from what most of the security community still deeply believes in and preaches all the time. But that's kind of my conclusion. Again, I not agree with it. And the basic idea is you build messy, not clean. And goes directly counter to all the kind of principles of software engineering. And I'll talk about compromises, how you can accommodate it with kind of what you really want to do in that case. And it draws on lessons from the past and the present. And of course, it's related to many things that are more familiar to people, such as defense in depth, resilience, redundancy, and other kinds of things. So that's what I'll be talking about. Okay. Now, something to bear in mind, and I think it's very important that this is something I don't see discussed. And we certainly hear constantly about insecurities. New break, hundreds of millions of email addresses leaked, for credit card numbers stolen, sort of new zero-day attacks, Stuxnet worm, other kinds of things. We hear about all the things that are going wrong. What we're not hearing about is how come we continue to live and live pretty well. What is the dog that did not bark? Yes, we have all this insecurity, but actually there haven't been major disasters. At least not major disasters due to computer insecurity. Yes, big earthquake strikes off the northeast coast of Japan, tsunami washes over the coast, 10,000, 20,000 people die. We have a nuclear meltdown polluting the atmosphere. Was computer insecurity implicated in any of those problems? Not that I know of. Katrina, big disaster, Hurricane Katrina, computers was not a problem. Think about the financial meltdown of 3 years ago. Yes, you could say that information technology was implicated in some sense in giving people false sense of hope and letting them create instruments that nobody could understand the complexity of. But again, insecurity was not a problem. It's not some hacker who got in and corrupted the programs running at financial institutions and brought the world almost to a halt. It's totally different reasons. And in fact, when you look at the numbers for losses from kind of say information system insecurity, they are small. I mean, of course, in many cases we don't know it, and of course you have to toss in the costs of actually maintaining these systems, which are much larger. You have all those security professionals running around, keeping things sort of operational, because that's a substantial cost. But say in terms of actual losses to, say cyber criminals, it's not that high. In particular, when you look at what it is that credit card companies are losing, the numbers are derisory. They are kind of roughly in the same range as from bank holdups, and that's really small. And that's far dwarfed by bad check losses to banks, which is dwarfed in its turn by losses to insider kind of misdeeds, which again is dwarfed by order of magnitude at least, if not more, by giant disasters like the financial meltdown of 2008. So how come, even though we have this litany of insecurities that is pouring out of all the media outlets all the time, well-founded, I mean, it's not exaggeration, these insecurities are there, how come the world does so well? And indeed, the world is actually doing quite well. You may not think so. Say if your parents lost their job or are had their home kind of evicted from their home or other kinds of things, but certainly on the world scale, there was a little bit of a hiccup 3 years ago. Right now, the world as a whole is growing vigorously. China is still growing about 10% per year. India about 8%. Overall, the world seems to be growing about 5% per year, GDP per year, growth per year. That's unprecedented in human history, and most people who look at it say, well, yes, information technologies play an essential role in it, too. In spite of all the insecurities in all these information technologies. So how come? Why does it work? So again, so that's really the big question. And I think it's not getting enough attention and should really be receiving it. And is it going to continue? Again, some people are concerned about what they sometimes call digital Pearl Harbor or digital 9/11. Suddenly, something horrible comes out there. Some worms, infect lots of computers, and then they all act in concert and bring our economy to a grinding halt. I'm very skeptical for some of the reasons that we'll be discussing. Okay. So the key point is security is not the goal, just as an enabler. And also so are information security, or information technologies. For the most part, people don't care about them. Technologists may do. They get entranced, by all these wonderful problems to solve and all the wonderful solutions they come up with. For the most part, society yawns. Society wants to do things and wants to use these as tools. And in particular, society doesn't really care about absolute security. They may talk about as if they were cared about it, but in fact, society lives with lots of insecurities. We tolerate it. Some of the things you have to tolerate. We have to tolerate magnitude 9 earthquakes of the northeast coast of Japan and other places. We have to tolerate big hurricanes. We also have to tolerate other things. We have to tolerate potentially unpredictable actions from our fellow human beings. How secure are we in this room? If one of you brought a briefcase full of dynamite with you, could take out this room, everybody in it, the whole building. Do we worry about it? Not here in Hanover, maybe in Baghdad, Iraq or so. People usually have a fair sense of where it is safe and where it's not safe or so, based on the context. So society lives with lots of insecurities. In fact, I mean, one of the things that astonished me, again, being kind of a techie at heart and thinking about the issues objectively, was the really strong reaction to 9/11. I mean, it's a tragedy, absolutely, I don't want to minimize it. 3,000 people died in 9/11, but we have more than 3,000 people who die each month on our roads due to car accidents. Mr. Henry Ford is from his grave, is killing 3,000 people each month, in effect. Yet we tolerate it. Society manages to live with quite a few risks. So the issue is really not providing absolute security. We don't have it in our physical life, so we shouldn't expect it in cyberspace. The question is, how much security do we need, and how can we obtain it? So, in terms of all this work, so in some sense, what I'm talking about here is very much a very strong, much a change from my attitude. I used to have this very common attitude among US technologists. We've got to kind of design security in at the bottom. We've got to persuade decision makers this is serious and pay attention to it. And then we're going to march off to a brave new world. Once we do that, I no longer believe it. I changed my view. I think we're going to kind of continue basically muddling along. And it's not that I want to kind of denigrate the work that other people and myself have done in the past. I think it's been useful. It also was intellectually stimulating. Lots of very interesting things came out of it. It was very mutually beneficial interaction. Mathematics benefited from the kind of stimulus of new applications for new types of mathematics, and mathematics gave back to the rest of society something useful, useful tools. But all that work is limited primarily by human nature. Okay? And so how do we compensate for it? And again, let's remember that human nature exposes us to lots of risks which are out there and which are actually fairly costly overall. Most of the problems that we see are not related to insecurities in formal systems. They are problems such as Nigerian 419 scam. Those email messages, kind of spam messages that at least I get several of these per day. I don't have very tight, spam filters, which saying, oh, I'm Princess Abacha, and I want this, I have this $30 million, I want to move your country, I'll give you 1/3 if you help me do it. Or I'm the auditor of a bank in Hong Kong, and again have secreted some money, and if you help me move it out, again, I'll give you a slice in that case. These things are called the Nigerian 419 scam because there is a special section of Nigerian Penal Code, section 419, which covers them. They predate the internet, go back at least half a century. For some various cultural reasons, they seem to be especially prevalent in Nigeria. And you would think that today, with the spread of the internet, all the people naive enough to fall for them would have been caught. They would be fully kind of fleeced. There will be nothing more to be gained. But no, apparently the estimates are that still a few $100 million are extracted out of innocent people. In some cases through repeated attacks. Okay? So people who got fleeced once get fleeced twice. In some cases by the same attack, it's the same scam. In the other cases by people who go after them saying, oh, I'm going to help you recover your money from those bad guys who cheated you before. Because often the same guy who knows that he managed to get money from you before now goes after you again, and they extract some more money. Okay? So people are naive. Social engineering, actually most of the attacks that kind of serious attacks that we have experienced involve social engineering, one from another. Of course, the spearing, phishing, spearing, and whaling, these various notions play a role, but even more primitive ones. Hi, this is Bob in computer support. We detect a problem with your computer. What's your password? And a large fraction of people give out their password. And then they are surprised when things go wrong. That happens. Some tests have been done. You would think that if anybody would understand, kind of dangers of giving out passwords, it would be people who work for the IRS. I mean, they have it drummed into them that there's the sacred duty to keep the tax information confidential. It turns out the IRS agents give out passwords too. Okay. Yes, the world continues to exist. Okay. In general, we see lots of things. Okay. Again, this kind of really became meaningful to me only recently when I started a new career as a teacher. I mean, before that I was a kind of a researcher and administrator. Now I'm really learning how to teach, and I teach undergraduates. And that reminds me of one of the things I remembered from one of my most influential college teachers. He was visiting my school from a technological university in Europe, and he once said that every time he drives over a bridge, his heart skips a beat because he teaches the engineers who design those bridges, and he knows how poor they are at mathematics. Okay. Yes, people are very poor at mathematics, and you see it. You read even most prestigious publications, Wall Street Journal or New York Times, they often confuse millions with billions. Okay. Some other things, actually most spreadsheets are flawed. And the world runs on spreadsheets. Yet again, there is another body of literature, kind of careful, peer-reviewed body literature, showing that if you look at practical spreadsheets that are used, typically when they pass a certain threshold of complexity, they are wrong. I'm not talking here about bugs in the Excel underlying spreadsheet software. I'm talking about the relations that are entered into the spreadsheets by users, which are then used for all sorts of business planning. Even peer-reviewed papers. You would think that now when you have PhD researchers who are publishing in peer-reviewed literature, they would be doing things properly. Well, it turns out many of those papers have kind of clearly flawed statistical reasoning and often arithmetical mistakes. Yet the world keeps functioning. Somehow the spreadsheets are flawed, yet typically your grocery store doesn't run out of milk. So what happens? Well, so let's think about it. Okay? But don't expect improvement in many of these features. Why? So again, the standard mantra in this industry, one that actually still continues to be propagated by many people, is that we should be teaching better security. And teaching it at a younger age and more intensively and so on. And again, I'm not knocking it down. I'm not denigrating teaching. We said you need to do some of it, but don't expect much help from it. Why? Because of countervailing factors. One countervailing factor is that the number of users of high-tech systems will continue to grow. Back 20, 30 years ago, you had hundreds of thousands, maybe a few million people who had access to these systems. So these are people who were most comfortable using computers and comfortable with formal reasoning. Moreover, these machines would tend to be isolated. Often were mainframes behind locked doors or so. Today, well, today, we have probably about 1 billion, 2 billion people who use the internet, but we have about 7 billion people who have cell phones, and these cell phones are increasingly becoming smartphones, sophisticated computers, getting networked together. We also have already some tens of billions of embedded processors, and those are increasingly getting networked. So the whole system is getting more complicated, and the users, ranks of users are growing, including more and more people who really don't understand formal reasoning and who are really technophobic and kind of don't really want to learn anything about how these systems operate. So don't expect much improvement from teaching. Okay. Now, on the other, so why is it? Yes.
Going back to the previous point.
Sure.
So does it mean that we will never be able to get to a point where machines will take over, like unmanned planes, unmanned cars, unmanned search engines, because we are not able to build secure systems, it's not safe to do so, or it means that in order to get to that point, we need to be able to teach better security?
No, okay, neither one. It's a combination. So basically, we will not have systems which are perfectly secure. On the other hand, we'll have systems that, through experience and better technology, will be convinced are secure enough that they don't fail too often. Already today, if you look at airplanes, especially most of the new fighter jets are called fly-by-wire systems. They are inherently unstable. A human being could not possibly control them. You have to have the automated systems that control the various surfaces to keep them safe, and that's now spreading also to civilian airliners. Landings, increasingly airplane landings are essentially automated. I expect there'll be much greater growth of automation, in cars too. It's just that these will be humongous systems which seem to be pretty secure, but we will never be absolutely sure, and occasionally there will be some disasters because you'll have strange interactions. The think of the flash crash of May of last year on the stock exchange. Still for the understand, has not been fully explained. Interaction of various automated programs in different trading agencies leading to something unusual. Okay. And so you have to build in circuit breakers. So I think, again, I'll be talking a little bit about it. Actually, something that I'll mention later, least expressive languages has some bearing on it. I think you have to be devoting more attention to building guard modules or kind of programs that kind of watch out for kind of have a little bit of almost like human sense, saying, you know, yes, this may look fine, maybe these equations check, but they produce a temperature of 10,000 degrees. Something is wrong. Okay, let's shut things down in some secure way, those kinds of measures. Okay. So, to proceed further, to think. So yes.
I just wanted to follow up and say, in general, the cost of the insecurity in the system, if you can take a look at cars driving themselves, is probably going to end up being less than the cost of cars not driving themselves, which is 3,000 deaths on the road every month.
Yes. Again, so I expect that technology will be introduced relatively slowly, and in fact, we already have it. Remember the anti-skid braking systems? You don't fully control your brake. The computer does it for you. Okay. You can step on the brake, but then exactly what goes on there is out of your control. Okay. And again, it's known that under some conditions this is produce paradoxical results, but on balance it seems to work fairly well. And actually, there are some other things, compensating things. There's kind of the risk temperature. We could talk, well, let me skip it. We can talk about it offline later. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the general philosophy of where security has come from and where it might come from in the future. And this is something which took me a long time to realize. So 1980s kind of was the golden age, I call it. So kind of I along with many other people, jumped into it in the early 1980s. And it really was a golden age. We had great hopes. And also there was lots of low-hanging fruit. Lots of things being done. And there was lots of excitement in that era. And the perception was we're going to build a brave new world out there. It was going to compensate for the weaknesses of the kind of human world with governments and lawyers and all the other messy things, and mothers-in-law and such like. So, so this was a golden age of civilian cryptography and security. We're developing all these wonderful systems, public infrastructures, digital signatures, what have you. But when you actually look at what was really spreading in 1980s, this was a golden age of the fax and of fax signature. So fax as a technology is really ancient, almost 2 centuries old, had been kind of invented early on, but had very limited use because of kind of limited technology. And then Japanese learned how to produce fax machines inexpensively around 1980, and they started spreading almost like kudzu wire, and essentially ubiquitous. And with fax machines came fax signatures. Now, what could be less secure than fax signatures? So here we're working on trying to build provable security using RSA and all sorts of other kinds of things, and yet it was fax signatures that the country was, or the whole world was embracing. Now, today, over 2 decades later, we've learned much more about the insecurities. We have all these lessons. We have had several presidents in a row talking about how we've got to improve security of our information technology systems. And what is spreading? Email checks. Increasingly, when you take your check to your local store and pay for your purchases, the store does not carry the check physically to its bank, but instead scans it and emails it to the bank. And I suspect very soon even individuals will be able to do it. I haven't heard of any bank offering it to individuals, but I'm sure that will happen too. Okay. Yes?
USAA does.
Which one?
USAA.
Really?
Yeah, I use it.
I see. Okay, good, thank you. Okay, my prediction was fulfilled before it was made. In that sense, okay, yes. Okay. So why is that so? Well, convenience, of course. I mean, there are advantages, and of course that's something we have to bear in mind. The reason that these insecure information technology systems have been spreading as rapidly as they have is that they provide advantages. convenience, low cost, speed, various other things that we don't need to go into. And they did it, and they spread in spite of the insecurities. So, but what are the insecurities? So you can think a little bit about it, about a fax signature. Why is it that these insecure fax signatures were used? Well, where were they used most commonly? In real estate transactions. Actually, I don't know whether it's true any longer now, but certainly when I was doing my last real estate transaction almost 10 years ago, selling my place in New Jersey and buying a new one in Minnesota, at that time, faxes were used constantly and fax signatures. On the other hand, when you think about those transactions, how much would, say, some criminal gain from forging a signature and forging the fax? A little bit of a confusion. You know, I mean, if I got a fax offering me $100,000 more than I hope to get for my house, I mean, I might have, again, my heart might skip a beat, etc. I might be excited about getting a free $100,000, but I mean, I wouldn't take it seriously. I'll just call up that person or call up my real estate agent, will straighten it out very quickly. And you observe that even in those days in real estate transactions, you didn't use a fax signature for the final closing. For real estate closing, there usually there was insistence on physical presence and witnesses. Okay. So why do we get security? Because a single fax is just one of many elements, right? Actually, in the entire real estate transaction, the buying or purchasing of real estate, you have typically many, many transactions. You have faxes, you have maybe emails, you have phone calls, you have physical presence in that case, and subverting any single one of them, or even two of them, doesn't do much damage. So again, you have to think about all these transactions in context of the entire sort of body of different interactions that are involved. And that's how we got up security. How do sort of credit card companies keep losses to a very low level? Well, they look at the patterns of usage. They mine their data, and they say, well, Andrew was, bought breakfast with a credit card in Hanover this morning, and now he's buying something, in San Francisco at noon. He obviously didn't fly it. Maybe it's legitimate, but maybe let's investigate or so. And and that provides some help. And that's requires a different kind of mindset, a different attitude of that to which I guess many of us, said myself, had, namely of having absolute security. So absolute security is kind of really bewitching concept, but it doesn't really apply to anything that we do in our real life. We have insecurity, and what we usually have these very complicated webs of transactions which are very hard to subvert without a really substantial effort. And you observe that many of these webs of interactions or transactions have very complicated relationships, which are in some sense a weakness, a complexity, but they're also strength, part of these elements that provide you with security. Example, while we were trying to develop sort of a notion of a digital signature, we're trying to duplicate what was already being done in the physical world, and we were hampered by the fact that there is no simple, clean definition of a legal signature. Why? Well, because that's how the world has evolved, and validity of a signature depends on the context very often. Yes, your bank may receive a check that looks like it's signed by you. Maybe it was signed by you, but if you had a gun held to your head, that's not a valid signature, not a valid transaction. On the other hand, the bank may also receive a check signed by you with an X. Even though it has a perfectly nice legible signature on file, the check signed with an X may actually be a valid signature. Maybe you went skiing, broke both of your arms, they are both in cast, and an X is the best you can do. X might be a valid signature. So human society has developed a lot of flexibility on how you deal with these situations depending on context. And that provides some of the strength and also, of course, some of the weakness that's involved in it. And so I think the big kind of shift in view that's called for here is that of cyberspace as an entirely new world. Actually, if you really want to see an extreme example of that, if you haven't read it, go to the internet and look for John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. About 15 years ago, he penned. John Perry Barlow is a very interesting guy. He was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He was a rancher. He was an activist in the Electronic Freedom Foundation and other agencies, and very stimulating guy to talk to. Very nice guy. So 15 years ago, he penned this Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which reflected some of these extreme views of building a totally new world, independent of the old physical world with all its limitations. If you read it, kind of, you can understand kind of how far some people went, almost off the edge in that sense, because today it really looks ludicrous. And particularly, he kind of explicitly defined cyberspace as a totally separate from the old physical world, and he was basically telling governments to get lost. We don't need you in there. In fact, though, the world is just the opposite. Namely, cyberspace is not separate. It doesn't compensate for weaknesses of human space, but just the opposite. They are intertwined, and we are using protective mechanisms of human space to compensate for defects of cyberspace. So now I get to the kind of conclusions, or what kind of my recommendations are in that case. So the problem is, as I mentioned, cyberspace has attractions. It enables action at lower cost, much greater speed than physical world. Now, in the physical world, we of course have lots of insecurities. Think about things such as locks. I suspect your house or apartment has a lock. I doubt if that lock would kind of withstand an attack by a professional burglar for more than 15 seconds. Yet it serves a purpose. It's not perfect security, but it serves a purpose. What's the purpose it serves? Well, it stops neighborhood kid from wandering in. That's one purpose. Second, if you do come in and find somebody inside, you have basically almost a prima facie evidence he or she did something illegitimate to get inside. So it's not perfect security, but that serves something. In cyberspace, of course, you have the problem that the burglar, professional burglar, is not restricted to kind of burgling 2 or 3 apartments or houses per night. He can act much massively. Yes, so question?
Doesn't that really kind of prove your point, though, that in physical space we have varying degree of locks and
yes,
we're trying to protect.
Sure.
In cyberspace,
yes,
kind of where you're headed.
Well, yes. So like any cyberspace, we could also have different degrees of locks.
We could, but by and large, HTTPS, SSL, and that's typically about it.
Sorry.
Basically, HTTPS, SSL, and 1 or 2 others, varying degrees of encryption. That's about it.
Oh no, but this is only the first level. Okay, now there are some other levels of security built on top of that, and which we can necessarily multiply or strengthen. Okay, we can argue about it. So kind of my argument, think about what happens in cyberspace, how we might provide security in cyberspace as in terms of providing speed bumps. Okay, not absolute security, just making things slower. In some cases, physically slower. And in fact, again, I'm not claiming this is a brilliant new insight, something kind of that's going to change the world instantaneously, because much of it is already being done in practice, such as slowing down money transfers. Yes, potentially money can fly around the world instantaneously, but we build in delays. A few hours, maybe a day, maybe wait until for transactions through a business day, so that responsible people can actually see how these big transactions filter through and see if something anomalous happens in there or so. An example of how we can slow things down and again use the protective mechanisms of the physical world is what happens with e-voting, electronic voting. Something very popular, understandably so. People like the usability factors of electronic voting. On the other hand, contrary to the claims of the manufacturers of these electronic voting systems, all of the ones that have been tested are woefully insecure, and almost certainly all of them are insecure. Not all of them have been tested carefully in that case. So fortunately, again, various kind of professionals, researchers have documented these insecurities, which has led to reassessment of what's happening. And one of the solutions, which I think is a very sensible one, which provides the advantages of electronic voting with some protective mechanisms, is to have a printed ballot of the votes that are executed on an electronic machine, which goes into a log box, which is then available for a recount. What does it do? Okay, well, first of all, it enables a recount. Second, it deters the bad guys, because now they know that if the results of a vote look suspicious, they don't agree with exit polls or polls taken prior to a vote, if there's some really a great anomaly, then people will go back and do a recount, and then their effort will be wasted. So here is a case where insecurity in cyberspace is compensated for by physical means from all traditional world, which is not secure. Ballot stuffing is kind of has ignoble tradition going back centuries. But we've sort of learned how to live with the insecurities of the physical ballot, and we managed to accept them. So here's one example. Here's another example which takes a little bit longer and also illustrates something nice. So say if you accept my kind of conclusion that we cannot build secure systems, that we're going to live with chewing gum and baling wire, can you think of positive aspects to it? Can anybody name anything positive?
Keep selling new products.
Exactly. Okay, it's a meal ticket for security professionals. Okay. And this actually brings up economic concerns, which is what I'll now be going to talk about and which are illustrated in this slide. Namely, what are the incentives? In particular, in this case, the insecurity provides incentives for us to keep teaching students, keep training students, and for students to take our courses, because then they can expect to actually find jobs. If you could build a nice, clean module which would take care of all the security needs, well, you would build it and would just simply disperse it all over the world, and that would be the end, in principle. Okay? So no, sometimes you have these perverse effects. And so here's another example. And by the way, this is an example of one of the areas, of most promising areas for employment for people with serious security training to enforce certain business models. So what is this? So again, as you may know, computer printer manufacturers, companies like HP or Lenovo or Canon, produce these very nice printers that have been increasing in quantity greatly and sell them very inexpensively. But then when you run out of the kind of cartridge gets exhausted, that comes with the first, with a printer, as you buy it, you go to buy a replacement cartridge, that one costs an arm and a leg. And for example, on some of these cartridges, the ink in there costs more than gold on a per ounce basis. Profit margins are astronomical in that case. And it's basically a business model. Give away the razor and you make money on the blades. And it's perfectly legal. On the other hand, it's also legal to manufacture compatible cartridges. And so there is an industry of so-called aftermarket manufacturers. And they actually come together at some industry conventions. I was once an invited speaker at one such convention, and they are almost at each other's throats. It's interesting to watch how some of their encounters. So these aftermarket manufacturers then produce compatible cartridges. Okay. So what this shows, the green line shows fraction of the market for the replacement cartridges that are coming from aftermarket manufacturers for the HP 8100 printer. That was many years ago, over a decade ago. And so you see about 1 month after the printer comes on the market, the aftermarket guys start selling replacement cartridges, and eventually after 2 years they get up to about 15 or 20% of the market. So of course HP is unhappy. HP because, well, first of all, they are losing this fraction of the sales. Second, they probably have to keep their prices for cartridges lower than they would otherwise if they had a true monopoly. So in the next generation of printers, the HP 9000, this time they build in a chip into the cartridge. So for a cartridge to print, the chip has to talk to the printer in order to provide better customer experience, higher quality of print, and that those chips in the printer and in the cartridge have a little bit of crypto built in. Okay? It's not perfectly secure crypto. The aftermarket guys, they have equipment that can strip away layers from integrated circuits. They also have, PhDs they hire to kind of look at these things and figure out how these chips are made. So they do produce a compatible cartridge, but this time it takes them 13 months instead of 1 month. And once they come to market, then the ramp up of the market share is comparable. So traditional problem in cybersecurity of how do you quantify the benefits of incomplete security, actually occasionally have an answer. HP knows how much it gained from this little bit of crypto it built in. It won't tell you, it's a kind of trade secret, but they know internally how much they gained, or at least they can estimate it fairly well. So you don't need absolute security. Even complete security works. And one of the reasons it works, again, even when you have very smart kind of attackers, they have limited resources, takes them a while to do things. If complexity grows, it takes them 13 months to do this. And that 13 months is a lot. Okay? So in general, other advantages, I told you kind of my main kind of solution or philosophy is build dirty, or build messy, not clean. And you see this actually done in practice. Here is a story from almost exactly a year ago. This kind of announcement, press announcement, or maybe presentation at some conference or other place by Apple about the iPhone operating system. It says, jailbreaking the operating system is a major source of instabilities and disruption of service. So now, do you think Apple really wants to have a nice, clean, modular code that people could muck around with? I think they would much rather have a really mess of spaghetti code, which causes which is a major source of instabilities and disruption of service when somebody jailbreaks the iPhone. Okay? Think about incentives. Brought in the issue of economics. There are very strong incentives, for producers to use these technologies. And again, I'm sure Apple would really love to have a perfectly secure system that nobody could jailbreak, but they now know that's impossible. Okay? So instead, they are producing things. Again, I'm not claiming that they are intentionally producing spaghetti code, but they are taking advantage of the spaghetti code. Saying, if we have spaghetti code there, then whoever kind of gets inside and mucks around with it is likely to end up with something which is unusable. Okay? And you see it also kind of in cyberspace. Look at scammers and phishers. And one of the things which makes cyberspace moderately secure is that there is almost like an ecology of crime, of cybercrime. There actually are not that many truly inventive guys who come up with new attacks. They tend to find them and then they sell them to other people who then build them into tools they sell to other people, and most of the attacks get implemented by script kiddies who kind of don't know anything really about the sophisticated technologies. And again, so they are kind of, thinking biological terms, they are kind of parasites, and good parasites, smart parasites, know better than to kill their host. So again, they have incentives to keep things under control and kind of spreading slowly. And also, they have incentives to maximize their value, which means, again, limiting the spread of the malware or so. And this is actually something we already could see back in the old pre-internet era, say in the kind of telephone credit card fraud cases and such like. So kind of my general conclusion is build messy and not clean. And by messy, I mean build things which have kind of lots of kind of webs of ties, various types of ties, often hidden ties, unpredictable ties from here to there. Also build kind of repositories of permanent records. We can see what happened, to what extent things got changed, which would at least let you keep track of changes that are made or intrusions that happen. And these ties, if they're complicated ties, they will again make it very hard for intruders to subvert the system entirely And also, even when they subvert it partially, even when they can abuse it and maybe steal some money or do other things, they will leave traces. And you see, they do tend to leave traces. That's why how digital forensics works. There's this famous cartoon in the New Yorker almost 17, 18 years ago, says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Well, that's just the opposite of what happens. In practice, people know a lot about you just from what you do on the internet. Again, because the internet is quite messy. So, okay, diffusion of information I mentioned is not instantaneous. Even hiding in plain sight works very often. And so my conclusion is, actually, there is quite a bit that can be done through security, through obscurity. So this is, again, something I used to believe was definitely false. I think most security professionals believe it's false, but I think there are benefits to it. Yes, it doesn't provide complete security. On the other hand, provides at least some delay. In many cases, just because there are only so many really clever people out there, if you're just dealing with something that's going to be out, you have its own little niche, not a major factor in the economy, that may be a perfect solution, okay? Because nobody may actually bother to break it. Something which I think much more research should go into is called obfuscation. Things like obfuscating compilers. Yes, so I understand the rationale for having nice, clean, modular design, all the principles of software engineering. Do it on the source code. Now, what you actually put out there to actually run these systems, make it obfuscated code. So that's very hard to reverse engineer. And so I think much more research should be done not on kind of developing nice, clean, public key crypto systems which have provable security, but instead on one-way transformations which preserve certain types of functionality. I think also we need more research on what I call least expressive languages. So these are kind of languages to be used for certain kind of guard programs or guard modules, which will just watch out for the functioning of the entire system and have something kind of equivalent to a little bit of human common sense to be able to kind of alert people or even sometimes shut down systems when they detect kind of abnormal functioning. And also, don't forget, most of the bad guys, all the bad guys are human, they make mistakes. Furthermore, most of the bad guys are stupid. Most of criminals, whether in cyberspace or elsewhere, are stupid, and so they really take to make mistakes. Okay? And so that's something you have to bear in mind. Again, there are not all that many really clever ones. So, this kind of very brief presentation. I have some more kind of data and some discussions, speculations in other papers on my website. I kind of welcome you to take a look at it. Otherwise, I'm ready for any questions or objections or refutations.
Conversation about cybercrime with somebody who's been studying that for quite a while, and I was kind of making the argument that you made that this is their now pool in which they're also swimming in, so they have no interest in really bringing the system down in any significant way because they, of course, require it to do their business. And his argument was that there are now what you could call neighborhoods, much more so on the internet, and they could stay in where they are in a protected neighborhood and attack this one over here much more so than used to be the case. And so they could bring down systems here and there while they can still maintain their system. And so that's a security risk in a way that, yeah, the entire infrastructure won't come down, but there still might be a threat to particular parts of that infrastructure. How would you respond?
Oh, certainly. And of course, remember, so here we're talking about, say, criminals who are trying to get money. That's not necessarily the case for people who have grudges or kind of who are crazy or kind of evil, say Al-Qaeda, who might want to bring everything down or so. On the other hand, you also have to, there are several factors to bear in mind. So I'm not even so concerned about Al-Qaeda. Reason is let's say terrorist organizations, they typically have goals. I mean, they have their internal dynamics, they have their internal logic, and bringing down data networks usually is not all that spectacular. I mean, it's one thing to have, buildings in flames, people falling off the, tops of roofs of skyscrapers, and big collapses and other kinds of things, which is kind of big spectacles that seems to kind of feed their kind of need for publicity and demonstrating their power, to kind of change the world. Somehow bringing the networks down doesn't have the same effect. So. Of course, you can talk about attacks on the systems, SCADA systems, so-called control of basic infrastructure, which might be more serious. But again, the usual kind of precautions with just common sense designs and having circuit breakers effectively there, I think would be partial solutions. Again, I'm not saying we should stop working on hardening such systems. So yes, I think that yes, people will be developing more sophisticated attacks, and we see some of it kind of in financial system, new ways to shuffle money around, and we just have to kind of defend against them or so. But again, I just can't quite see something like the digital Pearl Harbor or something that would really kind of bring the whole environment down. So, okay, so I'm not sure. I think maybe
Sure, yeah. I'm interested in what your view. So now, like recently, there's been this network neutrality debate going on, and then there's even further from that debate, there's also these issues of the U.S. government in particular, legislating different things about the way that certain servers will work that we kind of need to operate with. And how does your viewpoints on building software sort of play into this legislation issues, right? How do you see these two issues kind of together?
Well, okay, so I understand net neutrality. So net neutrality is not really directly germane to security here, kind of almost orthogonal to it. I can talk a lot about it because I have kind of written about it and talked about it and thought about it. I'm not quite sure I understand the second point you made about legislation.
I'm just curious, as far as philosophy is concerned. I mean, I for one think that it's ridiculous that there's all this bad stuff that's going to happen effectively, right? For lack of a shorter way of saying this, but I'm wondering if what you're saying about building messy code, right? Is that analogous to saying do something that prevents people from using the internet, or how is your philosophy here related to philosophy over there? I guess is what I'm trying to understand.
I'm not sure I quite see that.
Well,
okay, we can talk about it later, but I don't quite see that. I mean, yes, I mean, government can impose restrictions or can mandate some, say, open interconnection standards or other kinds of things. I don't see that as kind of directly, related to security. It's, I think it's almost orthogonal issue. It's a very interesting, very important issue, but it's not. I don't think it's quite the same. So maybe it's. Sorry. Okay.
So I have two questions. One is that, so what is it that you see people not doing with code obfuscation that they aren't doing now? Because I know, to some extent, organizations like Skype and Apple definitely do obfuscation of their binaries when it's released. And to some extent, this actually introduces some of the security problems that people are later able to exploit to reverse engineer or understand the systems. And also at the same time, there's also been some non-trivial amount of work looking at code obfuscation from a theoretical perspective in what senses it's possible. So what do you see as not having been done or people should apply more?
Oh, okay. So I agree with what you said. So I mentioned, well, Skype is a very good example, kind of organization that has been using code obfuscation very effectively. And in fact, what you observe is that some of these Skype systems have been reverse engineered, but usually took quite a while to do, again, not instantaneously. So when we see some of these things happening among these spammers or phishers, again, code obfuscation, more kind of polymorphic viruses and other kinds of things. So we see all of that happening. I'm saying let's do more of it, okay? And let's do it more systematically. So I feel more work should be done on code obfuscation.
Okay, just in terms of people actually
That's
looking
right.
will easily
Yes,
find.
and teach much more about it. So at least again, I have not done a careful survey of too many schools, but I have not seen much teaching about code obfuscation. I've seen a lot of teaching about writing nice, clean, modular code. So I think some balance should be shifted.
Okay, and just briefly asking another question. So you were discussing the idea of having sort of supervisor modules or something like that. So how is this idea you're proposing different from like what people were very excited for a while about, that is aspect-oriented programming? How's it different from the idea people were trying to get excited about in that topic?
Which topic?
There was this fad in object-oriented programming called aspect-oriented programming.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. Sorry. Yes.
Basically, you be able to annotate like sort of supervisory code.
Okay. Yes. So, so I'm not familiar with a particular aspect. On the other hand, these kind of monitoring modules is something that, again, is not novel, has been used before. In fact, it was used in the telephone switches. Kind of back, say, 30 or so years ago, the Bell system was among the leaders developing software. Hardware was extremely inadequate and had very complicated switches. And they had this code, which again nobody fully understood, complicated either, and they had the supervisory modules watching, and they usually had these dual processors kind of watching each other, and the control modules would sometimes switch control from one to the other when one seemed to be going haywire in that case. So again, it's quite old, has been used. Again, I'm just advocating some more of it and doing it explicitly. Let's see, maybe this question, let's go back.
Two quick things. First, when you started in with your basic premise of comparing events in cybersecurity to physical space, that's something security will try not to let leadership.
Okay, good. Could you speak up a bit?
Sorry, when you compare events in the cyberspace arena to events in the physical arena, Katrina to losing data, I think that's a really false comparison. If you compare the loss of, say, financial or the monetary value of that information, not the physical impact, because it's really an apples and oranges comparison. I'd like your response to that. And the other one is when you say that in the initial premise that, well, we've gotten here, we've lost all this information, people don't seem to care. Do you believe that's because they don't care, they don't know, or to this point, it's information that they don't really have to care about? So if you lose my Amazon purchase record, I don't, even as a security professional, care as much. If you lose my entire medical and military record, I'm going to care a lot. And so now what's happening that I think people are building on your premise that, well, this kind of works so far, so now we're spreading the system. So is that the way we should be headed? Should we be relying on these secure systems for stuff that actually does matter versus stuff that doesn't?
Okay. So as a first point, absolutely it's apples to oranges. On the other hand, kind of the bottom line is what's the loss? How much of a disruption to our life, how much human tragedy or so on are we suffering from either natural kind of disasters or cyber insecurity? And so at some level, I think one can compare them. And so that's, I feel it's not an illegitimate use, but certainly it is a different kind of situation. On the second point, so yes, however, one of the points I was making here, actually it's right on this slide, the bottom one is permanent records. So like write only, write once memories, I think is valuable. So I don't see how we can provide absolute security for preventing people, intruders from getting in and finding out about even the most private information. On the other hand, I think we can basically provide almost perfect security for preservation of the data, okay? Such as having multiple copies on kind of technologies where you can only write once.
So if you're going to confidentiality doesn't exist.
Well, so confidentiality will be just porous. So you will not have absolute confidentiality. You would have some barriers, and occasionally people would overcome them. And that's, of course, what happens already in the physical world.
But even in the physical world,
I mean, what is absolute security? You go to safe manufacturers. I mean, they'll give you some security ratings, but none of them will guarantee, the safes against, determined attacker with the right tools.
But if you compare the implications for security loss in the digital world to the physical world, they're much more severe. Take the Epsilon breach last week.
Yes.
They lost Chase, Citi, Marriott, about 8 other companies.
Yes.
Databases versus if you break into one company, you only get one.
Yes.
I think the implications are more strict for cyber versus physical.
Well, yes, but on the other hand, so this is a case that can, you don't really need new technologies in some sense. You kind of need to better kind of design of the systems, not centralized anywhere near as much as happening or so. And yes, okay. I imagine in cyberspace, bad guys can act much faster and lower cost than in the physical world. And so we've got to have these messy systems so that the guys cannot just go to a single place and find out all the information they might possibly want. You force them to attack a variety of different systems, protected with different mechanisms. And it's not a foolproof answer, it's just providing something that's good enough. And what's good enough? Well, you have to judge, and sometimes you'll be surprised, as we are often surprised in the physical world. Okay, so I think I had a question here. So first.
I was curious to your opinion about the whole green slate, clean slate movement at the internet, where to make security really work, you have to reinvent the internet, and that's been Clark's been talking about that for 10 years. There's multiple NSF programs on that, so there's a whole body of people saying, hey, to really make this squeaky clean, we've got to do this. So that runs in the face of your messy world. What's your opinion about the whole clean slate movement?
Well, I have various opinions, but most of them have little to do with security. Well, first of all, if you were going to, if you had any hope of designing a totally secure kind of information technology system, you would need to redesign the internet. Agreed. On the other hand, I don't think there's any hope. Even if you manage to design a secure replacement for the internet, the rest of the information technology systems would remain insecure. You would also need to fix Windows. You'd also need to fix Adobe Acrobat and all the database software. So on. I mean, fixing the internet won't help you. Okay, I mean, it will be kind of a little patch.
What about if you could build a secure internet as an overlay? Everything needs to be overlays.
So what do you mean by secure overlay?
Well, that all routes and all interaction is just on the end system. So you can't secure the internet.
Yes.
But you can secure the edges and therefore build an overlay. So I agree with you. It's very unlikely that you could redesign or re-architect the internet, but you could do the edges. Right?
Yes.
Just wondering if the future securing of the internet is at the overlay.
No, but see, kind of my point is that the internet is a transport mechanism. And so to have a secure entire system, you would have to have all the other components be secure. Okay? So yes, suppose you have current internet, which is buggy, you design a secure overlay on it, but now what does that secure overlay do? Well, it transports things, it transports PDF files. Well, so now I can send you a kind of bugged, kind of trapped email with specially crafted PDF that subverts your PC, which of course has an insecure Windows, and therefore now I take over your PC. Secure internet wouldn't prevent that. So yes, I mean, again, it doesn't mean that it's not a good idea to re-engineer the internet. I think there are other reasons for trying to do it, but we can talk about. I'm skeptical if it's possible to do a replacement. Again, if you're curious, my view is that the internet is not the best of all possible kind of communication networks. On the other hand, it has so much momentum. it's very hard for me to see something replacing it. Sorry, yes, let's see.
What are your thoughts on the kind of the added costs that this idea of kind of building messy would make? For example, if you're generating a lot of spaghetti code or doing some sort of obfuscation, it may be a lot harder for you to maintain that. So what would your thoughts be on the added costs?
Oh yes. Well, so I mean, again, this is we're going to look at what people do in practice. People have trade-offs, also, and so you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I understand the attraction of nice, clean, modular design. Kind of, from a technologist perspective, it's the only sensible thing. So, sure. But on the other hand, we have to deal with the fact that we cannot build them securely, and there are bad guys out there who are going to be subverting these systems. So we have to compromise. So, I think we had a question.
Well, I was just going to make a point on, people on the medical records, right? People do lose their medical records. Medical records are lost all the time, and that it would be a personal tragedy, but in many ways, healthcare is delivered without records all the time. So the world actually operates without those records. And Katrina was an example. Actually, all of the medical records for many of the systems were wiped out in Katrina. And so part of the tragedy was that they rebuilt the system. So even losing those records that are meaningful is not really, it doesn't have the effect of, the people who die.
Human society in general is remarkably resilient. You look at the record of major disasters, even wars, and societies manage to rebuild very quickly. And losses too, things come to a grinding halt. You look at Egypt, government shut down the internet, shut down, I think, cell phones, most everything else for a while. Well, yes, their economy took a hit, but kept functioning. In general, kind of shutting down the internet, for a few days, I don't think that would really kill us. In most organizations, most well-managed organizations have kind of fallback plans when things go wrong. At airports, the kind of gate agents, they know what to do when the computers freeze, which they do. Okay, I mean, of course, then the planes don't fly quite as full, and there are all sorts of other costs that are involved, but still, system sort of functions. It's a part capacity. So, yes, sorry.
I think that Jason making a comment on obfuscation. Yeah, I agree with it, but I think the way you're saying it, I think you still want to build it like you develop tools. You want to build them clean, you want to take the hell out of them afterwards. I don't think you want to say you don't want to build clean code. You want to teach people to build clean code, teach them the value of obfuscating stuff like that out there. That's more correct.
Well, it depends. So again, in some cases when you can, say if you're starting from scratch and you have good coders, write nice clean code, and then you use obfuscating compilers, so to produce messy executable. In other cases, you're just dealing with legacy code, and a huge fraction of most of the software that's running our systems, and will continue running it for a long time, will be messy. And in those cases, you can just rely on the inherent messiness in there. In fact, in a couple of cases where I was making similar presentations, and like I was getting lots of objections, people from the audience spoke up and said, "Oh yes, in my job, so many years ago, we had this code. We didn't bother with any kind of copy protection or scheme or anything else because we knew nobody could do much with it without our assistance." Okay.
That will be our final statement, so thank you.